Officer Michael Torres had been protecting the streets of Mesa County for 15 long years. At 42 years old, he was the kind of cop everyone respected. Kids in the neighborhood would wave at him when he drove by in his patrol car. Shop owners felt safe knowing he was watching over them. His fellow officers trusted him completely. Michael wasn't just good at his job, he truly cared about people. He would stop to help elderly folks cross busy streets. He knew the names of most kids in town and always had a kind word for them. When families were going through tough times, Michael would quietly help them out. He never wanted recognition for these acts of kindness. He just believed it was the right thing to do. On that chilly October evening in 1985, everything seemed normal at the Mesa County Sheriff's Department. The autumn air was crisp and the leaves were starting to change colors. Michael finished his paperwork and was getting ready to head home. His wife, Elena, was making his favorite dinner, and tomorrow was their daughter's birthday. Little Isabella was turning 11, and Elena had spent weeks planning the perfect celebration. As Michael was about to leave the station, dispatch received an unusual call. Someone reported strange activities happening near Devil's Canyon, a remote area about 20 miles outside of town. The place got its scary name from the dangerous cliffs and deep ravines that made it almost impossible to navigate in the dark. Most locals avoided the area, especially at night. The caller sounded nervous and wouldn't give their name. They said they had seen suspicious vehicles and people acting strange near the old mining road that led into the canyon. The area had become a dumping ground for people trying to get rid of things they didn't want found. Old cars, broken appliances, and other unwanted items often ended up there. Michael's supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, was about to assign the call to the night shift. But Michael stepped forward and volunteered to check it out. He had been working on several cases involving illegal activities in remote areas around the county. Something about this call caught his attention. "I'll take a quick look on my way home," Michael told the captain. "It's probably nothing, but better to be safe." "Captain," Rodriguez nodded. He knew Michael was thorough and would handle whatever he found out there. The captain had no idea this would be the last conversation he would ever have with Officer Torres. Michael gathered his equipment and headed toward his patrol car. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few vehicles belonging to the night shift officers. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. He checked his radio, making sure it was working properly. His flashlight was fully charged and his service weapon was secured in its holster. Before leaving the station, Michael called home to let Elena know he would be a little late. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and welcoming. "Hey, honey, dinner's almost ready. How much longer will you be? I have to check something out near Devil's Canyon. Shouldn't take more than an hour. Keep my plate warm." Elena paused for a moment. She knew that area had a bad reputation, but she also knew her husband was careful and experienced. "Just be safe out there. Isabella keeps asking when Daddy's coming home. She's so excited about tomorrow. Tell her I'll be home soon. And Elena, I love you. I love you too. See you soon." That phone call would replay in Elena's mind thousands of times over the coming years. Those simple words, "See you soon," carried a promise that would never be kept. Michael drove through the quiet streets of Mesa County as the sun was setting. The town was peaceful, with families gathering for dinner and children playing in their yards before being called inside. He passed the elementary school where Isabella would be starting 6th grade next year. He drove by the small church where his family attended Sunday services. Everything looked normal and safe. As he headed toward the outskirts of town, the buildings became fewer and farther between. The road started to wind through hills covered with pine trees and rocky outcrops. The familiar landscape gradually gave way to wilder terrain. Michael had driven this route many times during his career, but something felt different tonight. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, and darkness began to settle over the land. Michael turned on his headlights and continued toward Devil's Canyon. His radio crackled occasionally with routine calls from other officers, but nothing seemed urgent or unusual. About 15 miles from town, Michael reached the turnoff for the old mining road. The narrow dirt path was barely wide enough for one vehicle. Deep ruts and loose rocks made driving treacherous, especially in the dark. He slowed down and carefully navigated the rough terrain. The radio in his patrol car started to fade as he moved deeper into the canyon. The rocky walls and remote location made communication difficult. This was normal for the area, and Michael wasn't concerned. He had dealt with radio dead zones before. As he drove deeper into the canyon, Michael's headlights illuminated the narrow road ahead. The beam of light caught glimpses of abandoned items scattered along the sides of the path. Old tires, broken furniture, and rusted metal created an eerie landscape of discarded memories. Something caught his attention about half a mile down the mining road. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt suggested recent activity. Michael stopped his patrol car and got out to take a closer look. The tracks appeared to be from multiple vehicles, and they looked recent, possibly from earlier that day. He followed the tracks with his flashlight, moving carefully in the darkness. The beam revealed disturbed ground and what looked like evidence of heavy activity. Someone had definitely been using this remote location for something, and they had tried to cover their tracks. Michael returned to his patrol car and tried to radio the station. The static was heavy, but he managed to get through to dispatch. He reported his location and what he had found so far. The dispatcher acknowledged his transmission, but the signal was weak and cutting in and out. "I'm going to investigate further," Michael radioed. "We'll report back in 30 minutes. Those were the last words anyone at the sheriff's department would hear from Officer Michael Torres. Michael continued down the mining road following the mysterious tire tracks. His patrol car bounced and jolted over the rough terrain. The headlights swept back and forth as the road curved around large boulders and steep drops. About a quarter-mile further, he found what he was looking for. Hidden behind a cluster of large rocks was evidence of recent activity that didn't belong in this remote location. His training and experience told him immediately that something illegal was happening here. Michael parked his patrol car and got out to investigate on foot. He moved carefully, using his flashlight to examine the area. What he discovered confirmed his suspicions. This was definitely not normal activity for such a remote location. He was so focused on gathering evidence that he didn't notice the sounds coming from the darkness around him. Footsteps on loose gravel, whispered voices, the soft click of weapons being prepared. By the time Michael realized he was not alone, it was too late. Dark figures emerged from behind the rocks and trees. Men who had been watching and waiting. Men who couldn't afford to let a police officer discover their secret operation. Michael reached for his radio, but it was useless in this dead zone. He moved toward his service weapon, but he was outnumbered and caught off guard. The confrontation happened quickly in the darkness of Devil's Canyon. Back in town, Elena Torres finished setting the dinner table and waited for her husband to come home. Isabella sat at the kitchen table working on homework and chattering excitedly about her birthday party the next day. "When is Daddy coming home?" Isabella asked for the third time. "Soon, sweetheart. He just had to check on something for work." But as the minutes turned into hours, Elena's worry began to grow. Michael was never this late without calling. Something was wrong. At the sheriff's department, Captain Rodriguez noticed that Officer Torres hadn't checked in as scheduled. He tried calling Michael's radio several times but got no response. The captain wasn't immediately alarmed. Radio problems were common in that area. But as the night wore on and Michael failed to return to the station or answer his radio, concern began to spread. Other officers tried to reach him. Dispatch kept calling his radio number. Nothing. By midnight, Elena was pacing the floor at home. She had called the station twice, and each time they told her not to worry. But a police officer's wife learns to trust her instincts, and Elena's instincts were screaming that something terrible had happened. At 2 a.m, Captain Rodriguez made the decision to send a search team to Devil's Canyon. 2 patrol cars headed out into the darkness following the same route Michael had taken hours earlier. They found his patrol car just after dawn. It was sitting on the side of the mining road, driver's door open, keys still in the ignition. The radio was still crackling with unanswered calls from dispatch, but Officer Michael Torres was nowhere to be found. 20 feet from the patrol car, searchers found Michael's service weapon lying in the dirt. The gun hadn't been fired. 50 yards away, they discovered his flashlight with a cracked lens, as if it had been dropped or thrown. But there was no sign of the officer himself. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the scene. It was like Michael Torres had simply vanished into thin air. The discovery launched one of the largest search operations in Mesa County history. Within hours, the area was crawling with police officers, FBI agents, search and rescue teams, and volunteers from the community. Helicopters circled overhead while teams with dogs searched every inch of the rugged terrain. Elena arrived at the scene with little Isabella, both of them crying and hoping for answers that wouldn't come. The sight of Michael's abandoned patrol car was like a punch to the gut. His coffee cup was still sitting in the holder, half full and cold. For days, the search continued. Hundreds of people combed through Devil's Canyon and the surrounding areas. They looked in caves, ravines, abandoned mine shafts, and every possible hiding place. They found nothing. The FBI took over the investigation, treating it as a possible kidnapping or worse. They questioned everyone who might have information about Michael's disappearance. They investigated his recent cases, looking for anyone who might have wanted to harm him. But weeks turned into months and months turned into years. Despite all the resources, all the investigation, all the desperate searching, Officer Michael Torres remained missing. The case that had started with a simple phone call about suspicious activity had become the biggest mystery in Mesa County history. A dedicated police officer had driven into Devil's Canyon one October evening and never came home. His family was left with nothing but questions, grief, and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to the man they loved. The community lost a protector and friend, and somewhere in the darkness of that remote canyon, the truth about Michael Torres lay hidden, waiting to be discovered. The morning after Michael Torres disappeared, Elena woke up hoping it had all been a terrible nightmare. But the empty space beside her in bed and the phone calls from the sheriff's department made it clear that her worst fears were real. Her husband was gone and nobody knew where he was or what had happened to him. Isabella's 11th birthday came and went without celebration. The little girl kept asking when Daddy would come home to see her presents. Elena didn't know what to tell her daughter. How do you explain to a child that their father might never come home again? The first few weeks were the hardest. Elena barely slept, jumping at every phone ring, hoping it would be news about Michael. She kept his dinner plate in the refrigerator for days as if he might walk through the door any moment and sit down to eat. His coffee cup stayed on the kitchen counter, exactly where he had left it that morning. Friends and neighbors tried to help, bringing food and offering to watch the children, but Elena found it hard to accept their kindness. She felt like she was living in a strange dream where everyone else could see clearly, but she was trapped in fog. Nothing made sense anymore. David, who was only 8 years old when his father disappeared, reacted differently than his sister. While Isabella cried and asked questions, David became very quiet. He would sit for hours looking through family photo albums, studying pictures of his father as if trying to memorize every detail. At school, the other children whispered about the Torres family. Some kids were kind and understanding, but others asked uncomfortable questions. "Is your dad dead?" they would ask. "Why don't the police find him?" David learned to ignore these comments, but they hurt more than he could express. The financial problem started almost immediately. Michael's paycheck stopped coming, but the bills didn't stop arriving. Elena had worked part-time at a local store before Michael disappeared, but now she needed to find full-time work to support her family. The problem was that Michael's pension and benefits were frozen because he wasn't officially declared dead. The law required 7 years to pass before someone could be declared legally dead. 7 years of waiting, 7 years of uncertainty, 7 years of financial struggle. Elena fought this requirement, hiring a lawyer she couldn't afford to try to get Michael's benefits released early. "Mrs. Torres," the lawyer explained during one of their meetings, "I understand your situation is difficult, but without a body or clear evidence of death, the insurance company and pension fund won't release the money. They need proof. But we have proof he's missing, Elena argued. The police car, his gun, his flashlight. Something terrible happened to him. Missing isn't the same as dead in the eyes of the law. I'm sorry, but we have to wait. Those words, "we have to wait," became the soundtrack of Elena's life. Wait for news. Wait for answers. Wait for money. Wait for closure. Always waiting. Never knowing. To make ends meet, Elena took a job cleaning office buildings at night. She would put Isabella and David to bed, then drive across town to work until dawn. She came home exhausted, made breakfast for the kids, got them ready for school, and then tried to sleep for a few hours before starting the cycle again. The children learned to be independent very quickly. Isabella, despite being only 11, became like a second mother to David. She would help him with homework, make sure he ate his dinner, and comfort him when he had nightmares about their father. David's nightmares were frequent and intense. He would dream that his father was calling for help from somewhere dark and cold. Sometimes he would wake up crying, convinced he could hear his father's voice. Elena would hold him until he fell back asleep. But she was having her own nightmares, too. As months turned into years, the active search for Michael gradually wound down. The FBI agents moved on to other cases. The volunteers stopped coming. The newspaper stopped writing articles about the missing police officer. It seemed like everyone except the Torres family had accepted that Michael was gone forever. But David couldn't accept it. Even as a young boy, he became obsessed with finding out what happened to his father. He would ride his bicycle to the library after school and read every newspaper article about the case. He memorized the details of that October night when his father disappeared. When David turned 13, he started asking Elena to take him to Devil's Canyon. He wanted to see the place where his father's patrol car had been found. Elena refused at first, thinking it would be too painful for both of them. But David kept asking, and finally she agreed. The drive to Devil's Canyon was silent and emotional. Elena hadn't been back to that place since the day after Michael disappeared. The memories came flooding back as they turned onto the old mining road. The same rocky terrain, the same dangerous curves, the same feeling of isolation and dread. David got out of the car at the spot where his father's patrol car had been found. He walked around slowly, looking at everything with the careful attention of someone much older than his years. He picked up small rocks and examined them. He studied the tire tracks that were still visible in the dirt. "What are you looking for?" Elena asked. "I don't know," David answered honestly. "Something everyone else missed." This became David's pattern. Every few months he would ask Elena to drive him back to Devil's Canyon. Sometimes she would go with him. Sometimes she was too emotionally exhausted and would ask a family friend to take him instead. David would spend hours at the site, always looking for something that might explain what happened to his father. Isabella dealt with her father's disappearance differently. As she got older, she threw herself into school activities and sports. She became an excellent student and a talented athlete, as if staying busy could keep the pain away. But late at night, when the house was quiet, she would cry into her pillow for the father she barely remembered. The most difficult times were holidays and special occasions. Father's Day was especially hard. Isabella's graduation from high school was bittersweet. David's first football game, his first date, his high school graduation, all the moments when a father should be present were marked by Michael's absence. Elena tried to be both mother and father to her children, but she knew she couldn't fill the hole that Michael's disappearance had left in their lives. She watched other families with complete parents and felt a deep sadness for what her children had lost. The community's support, which had been strong in the beginning, gradually faded as people moved on with their lives. Elena understood this. People had their own problems to deal with, but it was lonely being the family with the missing father, the family that everyone pitied but didn't know how to help. David's obsession with his father's case grew stronger as he got older. In high school, he wrote every research paper about criminal investigations or missing persons cases. He studied police procedures and forensic science. His teachers were impressed by his knowledge and dedication, but Elena worried that her son was too focused on the past. "David," she would say, "you need to think about your future. not just about what happened to your father. This is my future. Mom, David would reply. I'm going to find out what happened to him. After high school, David enrolled in criminal justice classes at the local community college. He devoured textbooks about investigation techniques and cold case procedures. He learned about new technologies that might help solve old mysteries. Every piece of knowledge felt like a step closer to understanding his father's disappearance. Isabella chose a different path. She received a scholarship to attend college in another state, far from the memories and questions that haunted her hometown. Elena was proud of her daughter's success, but she was also heartbroken to see her go. Isabella needed to escape the shadow of her father's disappearance, and Elena understood that. With Isabella away at college, the house felt even emptier. Elena and David were alone with their memories and their questions. They would sit at the dinner table, two people in a house that had once been filled with laughter and conversation. Michael's empty chair seemed to grow larger every day. David graduated from community college with honors and transferred to a 4-year university to study criminal justice. His professors were impressed by his passion and dedication. They didn't know that his motivation came from a deep personal need to solve the mystery that had shaped his entire life. During his junior year, David made a decision that would change everything. He decided to become a private investigator. Not just any private investigator, but one who specialized in cold cases. Cases that the police had given up on. Cases that families like his own were still desperately trying to solve. Are you sure about this? Elena asked when David told her about his career plans. It's going to be hard dealing with other people's tragedies all the time. Mom, I've been dealing with tragedy my whole life, David replied. At least this way, maybe I can help other families find the answers we never got. Elena understood. Her son had found a way to turn his pain into purpose. She was proud of him, but she also worried about the toll this career choice might take on his emotional well-being. After college, David got his private investigator license and started his own small agency. His first cases were simple: cheating, spouses, insurance fraud, missing pets. But gradually he began taking on more complex cases. Families of missing persons started seeking him out, drawn by his reputation for thoroughness and his personal understanding of their pain. With each case he solved, David felt like he was getting better at his craft. He developed techniques for finding information that others had missed. He learned how to interview witnesses and how to spot lies. He became skilled at reading police reports and identifying gaps in investigations. But the one case he couldn't solve was his own father's. Despite all his training, all his experience, all his passion, David couldn't find the answers his family needed. Michael Torres remained as mysterious and unreachable as ever. The 20th anniversary of Michael's disappearance came and went. Then the 25th. Elena was now in her 60s and her health was starting to decline. The stress of decades of uncertainty had taken its toll on her body and mind. David was married now with a young daughter of his own, but his obsession with his father's case had strained his marriage. His wife often complained that David spent more time thinking about his missing father than he did focusing on his present family. She wasn't wrong. David's home office was filled with boxes of files, photographs, and notes related to his father's case. He had interviewed every person who might have information. He had studied every piece of evidence dozens of times. But nothing had changed. Michael Torres was still missing, and his family was still living with the pain of not knowing what had happened to him. As the 30th anniversary of the disappearance approached, David felt a mixture of sadness and frustration. 3 decades had passed, and he was no closer to solving the mystery than he had been as an 8-year-old boy. He began to wonder if he would ever find the answers he had spent his entire adult life searching for. Elena, now 75 years old, had grown more accepting of the uncertainty. She had learned to live with the questions, even if she couldn't answer them. She had found a measure of peace in her faith and in watching her children build their own lives. But David couldn't let go. The need to know what happened to his father burned as strongly as ever. He continued to investigate, continued to search, continued to hope that someday he would find the truth. Little did he know that the truth was waiting for him in the very place where his father had disappeared 30 years earlier. The answers he had spent his life searching for were hidden in the depths of Devil's Canyon, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The summer of 2015 was one of the driest on record in Colorado. Rivers that usually flowed year-round became shallow creeks. Lakes that families had enjoyed for generations dropped to levels nobody had ever seen before. The drought was affecting everything. Farmers were struggling, wildlife was searching for water, and scientists were worried about the long-term effects on the environment. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had been studying water systems in Colorado for over 15 years. She worked for the state environmental department, and her job was to understand how drought conditions were changing the landscape. Jennifer had always been passionate about protecting natural resources, and the current drought was giving her plenty of work. In September 2015, Jennifer was leading a team to study Devil's Canyon. The area had several small streams and underground water sources that fed into the larger river system. Understanding what was happening there would help scientists predict how the drought might affect other areas. Jennifer had heard stories about Devil's Canyon over the years. Local people talked about the dangerous terrain and the mysterious disappearance of a police officer back in the 1980s. But as a scientist, she was more interested in rock formations and water flow than in old legends and unsolved mysteries. Her team was using the latest technology to survey the canyon. They had drones equipped with high-resolution cameras that could capture detailed images of areas that were too dangerous for people to explore on foot. The drones could fly into narrow ravines and photograph places that had never been properly documented. On a crisp morning in late September, Jennifer was operating one of the drones from a safe position on the canyon rim. She guided the small aircraft down into a deep ravine that had been completely flooded for as long as anyone could remember. But now, with water levels at historic lows, the bottom of the ravine was visible for the first time in decades. The drone's camera was sending back clear images to Jennifer's laptop screen. She could see the rocky bottom of the ravine, scattered boulders and debris that had been washed down from higher elevations over the years. Most of it looked like natural material, fallen trees, rocks, and sediment. But then something caught her attention. In one corner of the ravine, partially hidden under fallen rocks and accumulated debris, was something that definitely didn't belong in nature. It was metallic, with straight edges and corners that were clearly man-made. Jennifer adjusted the drone's position to get a better view. She zoomed in with the camera and increased the image brightness on her laptop. What she saw made her heart race. Buried under years of debris was what appeared to be a vehicle, and not just any vehicle, but one that had been there for a very long time. "Hey, come look at this," Jennifer called to her research partner, Dr. Robert Chen, who was working with another drone nearby. Robert walked over and looked at Jennifer's laptop screen. His eyes widened as he saw what the camera had captured. "Is that a car?" he asked. "I think so," Jennifer replied. "And from the looks of it, it's been down there for years, maybe decades." Jennifer carefully maneuvered the drone to get images from different angles. The vehicle was severely damaged and corroded, but she could make out what looked like the remains of a pickup truck. The metal was rusted and twisted, and much of it was buried under rocks and debris. But there was no doubt. This was a vehicle that had somehow ended up at the bottom of this remote ravine. Robert was already reaching for his phone. "We need to call the authorities," he said. "This could be evidence in an old case." Jennifer nodded, her mind racing. She had lived in the area long enough to remember stories about missing persons and unsolved mysteries. Could this vehicle be connected to one of those old cases? Within 2 hours, the canyon was buzzing with activity. Sheriff's deputies, detectives, and crime scene investigators had arrived to assess the situation. The same remote location that had been silent and isolated for 30 years was suddenly filled with people and vehicles. Detective Lisa Martinez had been with the Mesa County Sheriff's Department for 12 years. She had heard the story of Officer Michael Torres many times from older colleagues who had worked on the original case. Lisa had even read through the case files several times, fascinated by the mystery of the vanishing police officer. When Lisa received the call about a vehicle discovered in Devil's Canyon, her first thought was about the Torres case. Could this be the breakthrough that everyone had hoped for? Lisa arrived at the scene and immediately began coordinating the recovery operation. Getting the vehicle out of the ravine would be dangerous and expensive, but it had to be done. The terrain was treacherous, and specialized equipment would be needed to safely extract whatever was down there. Meanwhile, news of the discovery was spreading through the community. David Torres heard about it through his contacts in law enforcement. His phone rang at 2:30 in the afternoon while he was working on a missing person case for another family. "David, this is Detective Martinez from Mesa County. I think you should know that we've found a vehicle in Devil's Canyon. We don't know what it is yet, but given the location and the apparent age of the vehicle, we thought you should be aware." David's hands started shaking. For 30 years he had been waiting for this phone call. He had imagined it thousands of times, but now that it was actually happening, he felt overwhelmed. "What kind of vehicle?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We don't know yet. It's badly damaged and corroded. We're organizing a recovery operation, but it will take a day or two to get it out safely." David thanked Detective Martinez and immediately called his mother. Elena was at home tending to her small garden when the phone rang. At 75, she had learned not to get her hopes up about potential breaks in her husband's case. Many false leads over the years had taught her to be cautious. But when David told her about the vehicle discovery, something deep inside her stirred. A mixture of hope and fear that she hadn't felt in years. "Should I come?" Elena asked. "Let me. Go first, Mom. Let me see what they find. If it's Dad, I'll call you right away." David drove to Devil's Canyon with his heart pounding. The same road his father had traveled 30 years earlier. The same route that had haunted David's dreams for his entire adult life. As he got closer to the canyon, he could see the activity: police cars, emergency vehicles, and people in uniform working around the site. Detective Martinez met David at the command post that had been set up near the canyon rim. She was a tall woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that immediately put David at ease. "The recovery team is preparing to go down into the ravine," she explained. "It's going to be slow and careful work. The vehicle is wedged between some large rocks, and we don't want to cause any more damage than necessary." David looked down into the canyon where his father had disappeared. Somewhere down there, hidden for 3 decades, might be the answers he had spent his life searching for. The recovery operation began the next morning. A team of specialists with ropes and pulleys carefully descended into the ravine. They worked, slowly, documenting everything with photographs before disturbing anything. Each piece of debris had to be carefully removed and examined. David waited at the top of the canyon, pacing back and forth as the hours passed. Other family members and friends had joined him, creating a small crowd of people who had been touched by Michael Torres's disappearance. Elena arrived in the afternoon, supported by Isabella, who had flown in from her home in California. As the sun began to set on the first day of the recovery operation, the team had managed to clear away most of the debris surrounding the vehicle. What they found confirmed everyone's fears and hopes. It was definitely a pickup truck, and it appeared to have been there for decades. On the second day, the recovery team was able to get a clear view of the vehicle's license plate. Despite the corrosion and damage, some of the numbers were still visible. Detective Martinez compared them to her records and felt her heart skip a beat. The partial license plate number matched the registration records for Michael Torres's personal vehicle, a blue 1982 Ford pickup truck that had never been reported, missing because everyone assumed he had taken his patrol car that night. Detective Martinez climbed back up to the canyon rim where the Torres family was waiting. The expression on her face told them everything they needed to know before she said a word. "We believe we found your father's truck," she said gently to David and Isabella. Elena closed her eyes and took a deep breath. After 30 years of waiting, of wondering, of hoping and fearing, they finally had an answer. Not the answer she had prayed for, but an answer nonetheless. The complete recovery of the vehicle took another full day. Piece by piece, the truck was carefully lifted out of the ravine. As each section came up, investigators examined it for evidence. The metal was severely corroded, and much of the truck had been damaged by decades of exposure to the elements. But inside the cab of the truck, preserved by the dry climate and protected by the vehicle's structure, investigators found what they had been looking for: human remains, along with personal items that confirmed the identity of the victim. Michael Torres's wallet was still in his back pocket, containing his driver's license and a family photo of Elena, Isabella, and David. His personal backup weapon, which he always carried when off-duty, was found nearby. A small cross necklace that Elena had given him for their anniversary was still around his neck. The medical examiner's preliminary examination revealed evidence of trauma that indicated this was not an accident. Michael Torres had not simply driven off the road in the dark. Someone had put him in that truck and pushed it into the ravine, where it had remained hidden for 30 years. David stood at the edge of Devil's Canyon as his father's remains were carefully removed from the vehicle. The 8-year-old boy who had lost his father was now a 43-year-old man, finally facing the reality he had both feared and hoped for his entire adult life. Elena wept quietly as she held Isabella's hand. Her husband was coming home at last, but not in the way she had dreamed about for 3 decades. Still, there was a strange sense of relief mixed with the grief. The wondering was over. The questions about whether Michael was alive somewhere, possibly suffering, were finally answered. Isabella had flown back from California when she learned about the discovery. She had built a successful life far from the shadow of her father's disappearance, but now she found herself drawn back into the mystery that had shaped her childhood. Standing at Devil's Canyon, she felt a connection to the father she had barely known, but had missed every day of her life. The discovery of Michael Torres's remains was front-page news in the local newspaper. After 30 years, the missing police officer had been found, but finding his body was just the beginning. Now came the harder task of figuring out who had killed him and why. Detective Martinez knew that this was no longer just a missing person case. It was a murder investigation, and after 30 years, solving it would require every skill and resource the department had. The evidence from the truck would need to be carefully analyzed. Witnesses from 1985 would need to be re-interviewed. Cold case techniques would need to be applied to a mystery that had stumped investigators for 3 decades. For the Torres family, the discovery brought both closure and new pain. They finally knew what had happened to Michael, but they also had to confront the reality that someone had deliberately killed him. The loving husband and father hadn't died in an accident or from natural causes. He had been murdered and his body hidden in one of the most remote places in the county. As the sun set over Devil's Canyon on the day Michael Torres's remains were recovered, his family stood together for the first time in years. United by grief, but also by a new sense of purpose. They had spent 30 years wondering what had happened to Michael. Now they knew. The next chapter of their journey would be about finding out who was responsible and making sure that justice was finally served. The truck that had been hidden at the bottom of a canyon for 3 decades had given up its secrets, but it had also raised new questions that would need to be answered. The Torres family's long wait for closure was over, but their quest for justice was just beginning. The day after Michael Torres's remains were recovered from Devil's Canyon, Detective Lisa Martinez sat in her office, staring at boxes of evidence that had been stored for 30 years. The original investigation files were thick with reports, witness statements and photographs, but none of it had led to answers back in 1985. Now, with new technology and fresh eyes, she hoped things would be different. Lisa had worked cold cases before, but this one felt personal. She had grown up in Mesa County and remembered the fear that gripped the community when Officer Torres disappeared. Every police officer's family had worried that their loved one might be next. The case had become legendary in the department, a reminder of how dangerous police work could be and how some mysteries seemed impossible to solve. The first step was to re-examine all the physical evidence using modern forensic techniques that hadn't existed in 1985. Michael's clothing, though, damaged by 3 decades in the elements, was sent to the state crime lab for DNA analysis. His personal weapon was tested for fingerprints using new methods that could detect traces invisible to earlier technology. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Deep in the fabric of Michael's uniform shirt, forensic technicians found traces of DNA that didn't belong to him. The sample was small and degraded, but it was enough to create a genetic profile. When they ran that profile through the National DNA Database, they got a hit. The DNA belonged to Vincent Castellano, a man who had died in state prison in 2003 while serving time for armed robbery. Lisa pulled Castellano's criminal record and felt her pulse quicken. In 1985, Castellano had been under investigation as part of a drug trafficking ring operating in Mesa County. The same investigation that Officer Michael Torres had been working on before he disappeared. Lisa immediately called David Torres with the news. David was at home, trying to explain to his own daughter why Grandpa had been gone for so long and why everyone was so sad now that they had found him. "David, we have a major breakthrough," Lisa said. "We found DNA evidence on your father's clothing that belongs to Vincent Castellano. Does that name mean anything to you?" David had spent years studying his father's case files. He knew every name, every detail, every lead that had been followed and abandoned. Castellano was part of the drug ring Dad was investigating. But didn't he die in prison years ago? Yes, in 2003. But if his DNA was on your father's clothing, it means he was there the night your father disappeared. And if Castellano was involved, there might be others who are still alive. This discovery transformed the investigation. Lisa now had a clear direction to follow. She began tracking down everyone who had been associated with Vincent Castellano in 1985. Many were dead, some had disappeared, but a few were still living in the area. The investigation led Lisa to Tommy Rodriguez, a man now in his 60s who ran a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. In 1985, Tommy had been arrested several times for minor drug offenses, and police reports showed he was known to associate with Castellano's group. When Lisa and her partner knocked on Tommy's door, they could see the fear in his eyes. 30 years had passed, but Tommy still remembered that October night in 1985. He had been carrying that secret for 3 decades, and the weight of it had never left him. "We need to talk to you about Vincent Castellano and what happened in Devil's Canyon 30 years ago," Lisa said. Tommy's face went white. He invited the detectives inside and offered them coffee with shaking hands. His small house was neat and clean, filled with family photos and evidence of a quiet, ordinary life. But Lisa could see that Tommy was terrified. "I've been waiting for this day for 30 years, Tommy said quietly. "I knew someday you'd figure it out." Tommy told them about the night Michael Torres died. The drug ring had been using Devil's Canyon as a storage location for large shipments of illegal substances. It was perfect, remote, isolated, and rarely visited by law enforcement. They had been operating there for months without any problems. But on that October night in 1985, everything went wrong. Michael Torres had received a tip about suspicious activity in the canyon. Unknown to the drug dealers, someone had called the police department and reported seeing unusual activity in the area. "We were just finishing loading a shipment when we saw headlights coming down the mining road," Tommy explained. Vincent panicked. He said we couldn't let a cop see what we were doing. Michael had been driving his personal truck that night instead of his patrol car because he wanted to investigate quietly, without alerting anyone to police presence. This decision, meant to help him gather better evidence, had actually put him in more danger. When Michael got out of his truck to investigate, he was surrounded by 4 men, Vincent Castellano, Tommy Rodriguez, and 2 others named Carlos Gutierrez and Ray Bennett. They couldn't let him leave and report what he had seen. "We didn't plan to hurt him," Tommy said, tears streaming down his face. "We just wanted to scare him, maybe tie him up until we could get away." But Michael was trained, and he fought back. He was stronger than we expected. The confrontation had escalated quickly. Michael had tried to reach for his radio, but there was no signal in that part of the canyon. He had gone for his weapon, but he was outnumbered 4 to 1. In the struggle that followed, Michael was struck in the head with a rock. Vincent hit him with a big stone, Tommy continued. Michael fell down and didn't get up. We checked on him, but he was gone. Vincent said we had to get rid of the body in the truck. The four men had put Michael's body in his own truck and pushed it into the deepest part of the ravine. They had then staged the scene with his patrol car to make it look like he had disappeared while on duty. They planted his service weapon and flashlight away from the patrol car to suggest he had been taken by someone. Tommy's confession provided the details that investigators had been missing for 30 years, but it also revealed that two of the men responsible for Michael's death were still alive. Carlos Gutierrez was living in Arizona, and Ray Bennett was in a nursing home in Colorado Springs. Within a week, both men were arrested. Carlos, now 68 years old, initially denied everything. But when confronted with DNA evidence and Tommy's confession, he eventually admitted his role in Michael Torres's death. Ray Bennett was 72 and in poor health, suffering from dementia. But he had moments of clarity, and during one of those moments he confirmed the details of what had happened that night in 1985. The arrests made headlines across Colorado. After 30 years, the mystery of Officer Michael Torres's disappearance had been solved. The men responsible for his death were finally facing justice. For David Torres, the arrests brought a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He had spent his entire adult life searching for these answers, and now he had them. But knowing the truth didn't bring his father back or erase the pain of growing up without him. Elena Torres, now 76 years old, attended every court hearing. She wanted to look at the men who had killed her husband and stolen her children's father. She expected to feel anger or hatred, but mostly she felt tired. 30 years of wondering had taken a toll that no amount of justice could completely heal. Isabella flew back from California for the trial. She had built a successful career as a teacher and had her own family now. But she needed to be there for the conclusion of the case that had shaped her childhood. Seeing the men who had killed her father was difficult, but it also provided a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The legal proceedings moved slowly. Tommy Rodriguez agreed to testify against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence. His cooperation was crucial to the prosecution's case, as he was the only witness who could provide detailed testimony about what had happened that night. Carlos Gutierrez was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 68, it was essentially a death sentence. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars for a crime he had committed 30 years earlier. Ray Bennett's case was more complicated due to his health condition. The court had to determine whether he was competent to stand trial. Medical experts testified about his dementia and his ability to understand the charges against him. Eventually, the court ruled that he was competent enough to proceed, but his age and health were considered during sentencing. Tommy Rodriguez received a 25-year sentence for his role in the crime and his cooperation with the investigation. At 63, he would likely spend the rest of his life in prison as well. The fourth man, Vincent Castellano, had died in prison in 2003, escaping earthly justice for his crime. But his DNA had ultimately been the key to solving the case and bringing his accomplices to trial. During the sentencing hearing, David Torres was allowed to give a victim impact statement. He stood in front of the courtroom filled with family, friends, law enforcement officers, and media representatives, and spoke about the impact his father's death had on his family. "You didn't just kill my father that night," David said, looking directly at the defendants. "You killed our family's future. You stole my sister's wedding dance with her father. You took away my mother's partner and best friend. You robbed my children of their grandfather." David spoke about the financial hardship his family had endured, the years of uncertainty, and the emotional toll of not knowing what had happened to Michael. He talked about his own obsession with solving the case and how it had affected his marriage and his relationship with his own children. Elena Torres also spoke at the sentencing. Her voice was quiet but strong as she addressed the court. "For 30 years I have wondered if my husband was alive somewhere, possibly suffering," she said. "I have wondered if he tried to come home to us. I have wondered if he thought about us in his final moments. Now I know the truth, and while it is painful, it is also a relief." Elena talked about Michael's dedication to his job and his community. She described him as a loving husband and father who had only been trying to do his job when he was killed. She spoke about the impact his death had on their children and on the law enforcement community. The trial and sentencing brought national attention to the case. News outlets across the country covered the story of the police officer, whose disappearance had been solved 30 years later by environmental researchers studying drought conditions. Detective Lisa Martinez was recognized for her excellent work on the cold case. The successful resolution of such an old case brought attention to the importance of never giving up on unsolved crimes and the value of new forensic technologies in solving cold cases. For the Torres family, the conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. They could finally properly mourn Michael's death and celebrate his life without the uncertainty that had haunted them for 3 decades. In the spring of 2016, the Torres family held a memorial service for Michael at the same church where he and Elena had been married 35 years earlier. The service was attended by hundreds of people, family members, friends, fellow police officers, and community members who had been touched by Michael's story. David delivered the eulogy, speaking about his father's dedication to justice and how that same dedication had ultimately led to the truth being revealed. He announced that he would continue his work as a private investigator, specializing in cold cases and helping other families find the answers they needed. Elena found peace in finally being able to lay her husband to rest. She had kept his wedding ring in a jewelry box for 30 years, unable to decide whether to continue wearing it or put it away. Now she placed it in the casket with his remains, a symbol of the love that had endured even through 3 decades of separation. Isabella spoke about her father's legacy and how his memory had inspired her to become a teacher. She wanted to make a positive difference in children's lives, just as her father had tried to make a positive difference in his community. The Mesa County Sheriff's Department retired Michael Torres' badge number and created a memorial in his honor. A plaque was installed at the station recognizing his service and sacrifice. Every year on the anniversary of his death, officers would gather to remember him and renew their commitment to protecting their community. Michael Torres' story became a reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, even after being buried for decades at the bottom of a canyon. His case showed that justice might be delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied. The combination of new technology, dedicated investigators, and the persistence of a family who refused to give up had finally brought closure to one of Mesa County's most enduring mysteries. The environmental researchers who had discovered Michael's truck continued their work studying the effects of drought on Colorado's water systems. But they would always remember the day their scientific mission had helped solve a 30-year-old mystery and brought peace to a family that had been waiting for answers for 3 decades. David Torres continued his work as a private investigator, using the skills and determination that had been forged by his father's disappearance to help other families find their own answers. His father's case had taught him that no mystery is truly unsolvable. Sometimes it just takes time, technology, and the refusal to give up hope. The story of Officer Michael Torres reminds us that heroes don't always get to come home, but their sacrifice and service live on in the memories of those who loved them and the communities they served. Even 30 years later, justice can still be served, and families can still find the closure they need to heal and move forward.